Hello, everybody out there, and welcome back to the Global Mindfulness and Education Summit. I'm one of your two co-hosts, Dr. Chris Willard, author, mindfulness and contemplative practice educator, psychologist, and I'm so excited to be speaking today with one of my heroes in all of this work, one of the earliest pioneers in terms of really bringing this into the mainstream in Western culture, contemplative practice, meditative practice, author of a number of books about topics like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, putting those on the map in ways that we really think about in such different ways in leadership, in business, and trickling down into education as well. Dr. Dan Goleman, and most recently, he's the author of an absolutely wonderful book, Altered Traits, that he did with Richie Davidson, which actually, one of the things I really enjoyed about that book is it traces both your personal and history with meditation and contemplative practice, and kind of how it's changed the culture so much over the last few decades. So thank you so much for being here, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Chris, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your work, about this journey that you've been on, and kind of leading a lot of the rest of us in our culture on this journey as well, I would say.
Well, so I actually have a doctorate in psychology. I'm best known for the book Emotional Intelligence. I worked as a science journalist for years and years. I was at the New York Times when I wrote that book. And it really was an argument for social emotional learning. I felt it was about education, that we needed to open up the curriculum beyond just academics and look at students' emotional life and social life and help them get better, help them do it in the right way. And most recently, I wrote a book with Peter Senge, who's at MIT, on the future of social emotional learning, where I propose that mindfulness and cultivating compassion, along with systems learning, should all be part of social emotional learning. So I anticipated the mindfulness movement quite a bit. Let me back up again and say, I've been interested in meditation since I was in college. I started with a mantra method, and then during my graduate years, I had traveling fellowships to India that allowed me to stay in South Asia for about 2 years altogether. When I came back from the first year, came back to Harvard, where I was doing my clinical psychology degree, and I said, I think there's really something to this thing called meditation. They'd never heard of it. They're all psychoanalytic. And I said, it seems to really help people with stress, and maybe I could do a dissertation that looked at meditation as intervention in stress. And they thought that was a horrible idea. They also told Richie Davidson, who's a fellow graduate student of mine, that his interest in meditation was probably career-ending. Anyway, he looked at attention, I looked at stress recovery. At the time, there were about 2 or 3 peer-reviewed articles that we could cite in our dissertation that were directly on meditation. This is very early days, and there was a lot of skepticism in the climate that we faced. But we went ahead, and today, when we looked at the literature again for the book Altered Traits, Richie and I, we found there are about 6,000, more than 6,000 peer-reviewed articles on meditation. There's about 1,000 new ones on mindfulness that are added every year. It's really astounding, the growth of that research area. So to back up again, so I went to Asia, and I was interested in many different kinds of meditation. My first book was kind of a stab at seeing what the commonalities were. It's called Meditative Mind now. Please don't buy it or read it because it's very embarrassing.
Too late, I already read it.
However, I was fortunate in that I spent half a year studying with a monk named Nyanaponika Thera in Sri Lanka. At the time, he had written the only book in the English language with the word mindfulness in the title.
Wow.
The Heart of Mindfulness, or the Heart of, I forget what it's called. Anyway, and I looked at the psychological system, which is called Abhidhamma, that is contained within. He was an expert on that. And I also spent monsoon season in a small village reading a text called the Visuddhimagga. These are basically, that's a 5th century meditator's manual that talks about the stages of insight, starting with mindfulness and going to complete liberation. And it was a fascinating book and very tedious because it was not written as a book. It was written in the days when monks memorized. So it was full of repetition, but I kind of did the Reader's Digest that and folded it into meditative mind. So I have that background, but when I came to the West, I could see that it was way too early to interest many people in meditation, particularly in a deep strand, although in India I'd met Joseph Goldstein and actually introduced Sharon Salzberg to meditation, if you can believe that.
Wow. Thank you for another great addition you've helped bring into the world.
Joseph had been studying with his teacher Manindra in the Burmese Vihara in Bodh Gaya, and he was really, except for a few passing travelers, the only Westerner there until I showed up, and then I told everybody.
You ruined the party.
But Sharon was one of the people I told. And she came there and started studying Vipassana, and now the rest is history with her. And then I met Jack Kornfield before he became a meditation teacher, when he was finishing a doctorate. And so there was a group of us very early on who were kind of first gen in bringing meditation to the West. Ram Dass had been a big influence on me. He was the guy who got me to go to India, because he and Larry had been hired and fired in the same program I was now in at Harvard.
Oh, right.
Immediate bond. He came to Harvard in 1970 or 69 and talked about, he had just come back from India as Ram Dass, not Richard Alpert. So really, I was around during the early days of that phase of introducing meditation. Of course, there had been Zen teachers in America. There are many Hindu teachers who had come over. So it was here and there, but it was nothing like it is today, where it's very mainstream. You have it in education, you have it in business, you have it in people's lives. And that's very new. I remember when I was in India, this is how early it was. I was thinking, wow, this drink chai is so good. I hope someday I can get it somewhere in America. Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts or whatever.
Right.
So we've come a long way.
We sure have, and it's just such incredible stories to kind of look back like that. So you mentioned kind of feeling like it wasn't the time then for it to go mainstream. What do you think contributed to it becoming so mainstream now? And do you feel like that's entirely a good thing, or do you feel like there's been some trade-offs or compromises or not so good things? Or is that a concern that you have, do you think?
I think it's mixed. So one of the things that helped, I remember another friend of Richie's and mine from the Cambridge days was a guy named John Kabat-Zinn. Johnny, when we met him, was teaching yoga in the basement of a church in Harvard Square. He hadn't started in SR. And I remember early on saying to him, it would help a lot if you could get some research done about how effective this is. And I think one thing that has helped immensely is the steady stream of research findings that show, yes, this is good, helps you focus, helps you recover from stress. It's good for your genetics, epigenetics. It's good for health. It's good in many, many ways. And I think all of that has helped people get interested in it. And I think the efforts of people like John Kabat-Zinn, people like Sharon and Joseph, who have steadily been plugging away at this. And then I don't know if any specific person accounts for the enormous receptivity now, but it's there. And I think it's because of countless people who found this helps me, and I like to tell other people about it.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned to not read your early book about the universalities and the varieties of meditative experiences, but what did you find? Did you find that there's a lot of commonalities in meditative or contemplative experiences? And did you ever encounter what kinds of overlaps did you encounter with what people are maybe already doing in the West that could dovetail in a logical way? Do you feel like there was maybe some fertile ground for growth because of some practices that we already have here that already exist in education, and so maybe some of that might have been a bridge?
Well, so two things. Let me first talk about the commonalities. I was using the lens of the Visuddhimagga, which looks at two strands. It looks at one-pointedness, at concentration, and then it looks at kind of witnessing or mindfulness or vipassana, insight meditation. Those are two different attentional strategies. And I found that those exist in many, many different spiritual traditions. In Christianity, at least esoteric Christianity, in Sufism, in Hinduism for sure, and of course in the varieties of Buddhism. So that's one thing. But I think from the point of view of education, the way this makes sense is that it helps kids be clearer, more focused, and more calm. And that's the best state for learning. Right. So it just makes immense sense as a kind of preparedness for the mission of the school, which is to help kids learn. It also, as it turns out, makes kids better behaved, which teachers love. And it's calming kids down from the inside. Say, hey, calm down. Like the kids are already there, and also helping them focus, which I think today is more important than ever because distraction is a big tool of commerce these days. And kids and adults are more distracted than ever, I think, in human history. By their tech devices, which on the one hand can be great instruments to help learning, on the other hand, have every seductive thing that you want to be distracted by.
Right.
Quick. So I think kids need more what's called cognitive control. And it turns out that the circuitry for cognitive control overlaps largely with circuitry which is strengthened by mindfulness. So in a way, it helps the school with the very mission.
And I'm also just struck historically, if we look back, right, so many of these contemplative practices were developed in monastic traditions, and our education system was largely developed in monastic traditions, East and West. I mean, our entire higher ed system, and largely even our lower ed system is still, based on what people were doing in terms of learning for spiritual purposes, and that required a lot of contemplation. It required quiet spaces, whether it was libraries or monk cells or whatever it might be. And so that was also just preparing people for learning back then. And so bringing it back in just has such this clear logic to it.
Well, yes and no.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Is that schools are secular.
Right.
I think it's important to bring mindfulness into schools in a way which does not speak to any particular spiritual tradition, but is, in fact, the argument I make is from cognitive science, not from spirituality.
Right. I
say this helps kids hone the tool that's going to help them learn, which is called paying attention. Don't need any spiritual tradition. This speaks to your earlier question about what's lost and what's gained in the way mindfulness and other methods have been introduced to schools or to society in general. And I think on the one hand, something very important is lost when you extract a method like mindfulness from its spiritual context, because you lose the entire spiritual path. On the other hand, I remember talking to Joseph's early teacher, Munindraji in Bodh Gaya. I said, what do you think of teaching people mindfulness or meditation outside the context of Buddhism? He was a Buddhist. And he said, oh, that's fine. He says, because it will benefit them. Point of view of helping people, it's fine to put aside the spiritual clothing of the method and help them just pay more attention and be more concentrated, because that benefits them. It benefits them both attentionally and, it turns out, physiologically. calming too. So on the one hand, doing that allows mindfulness to go to scale. Anybody can do it. On the other hand, what's lost is the depth. You'll only go so far if you go that path without going through the full, like a retreat and so on, where you go more deeply and you do it within the context of a spiritual evolution. I think they're two different things. And from my point of view, both are fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think we need to come up with more context for mindfulness in that way? Sometimes I think about, it works in other parts of the world, in other cultural contexts, because there's also other cultural values. There's a cultural context, there's a value system, there's a spiritual path as part of it. Do you feel like in the West we should think about our own adapted kind of value system to go with mindfulness and with teaching mindfulness?
The West is a very quirky culture within the cultures, the wide sweep. There is no particular spiritual tradition that holds sway here, and that's explicit. There's freedom of religion. So I would say it's an individual choice, and some people will go that route, and most people probably won't.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody will benefit to some degree.
Yeah, yeah. Can we turn a bit toward social and emotional learning and these notions of emotional intelligence and social intelligence that you did a lot of work to really help popularize, again, both in the larger culture, in the business sphere, and which has also really trickled down into education. You mentioned that new book on the future of SEL. Can you share a little bit about that and what you see happening, what is happening?
Last week, I went to the 25th anniversary of an organization called CASO, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. This was the organization that about 7 of us got together and started, which then brought social emotional learning to classes around the world. It's not in every school, but it's an enormous number. I mean, literally millions of kids now have this kind of instruction. And it's a natural platform for mindfulness in education, because mindfulness is a very simple add-on. It becomes another part of something that's already well instantiated in schools. And emotional intelligence in my model has 4 parts. There's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness or empathy, and then putting all those together for relationship management. And the best SEL programs cover all parts of it. They do it in a developmentally appropriate way. So you might teach the same lesson over and over, but in different levels of sophistication, depending on the cognitive abilities of kids at that age. And the programs, there's one thing I like about it, it's very well studied. And it's very clear from methodologically good outcome research that it helps, that it makes a difference. The kids are better behaved, the kids like school more, there's less bullying, there's less violence, there's less of the negative things in school, and academic achievement scores go up. All that is very well established now by studies, and I'd like to see that done with mindfulness in education. I think it's important to get the evidence base that shows not just that, oh, isn't this a keen idea, but hey, it really helps kids.
Right. Right. And it's exciting to see the body of research. I mean, you really dove deep into the research for adults and for everybody. And I think a lot of the kid research, there's some good stuff coming out. It's still in its infancy. But I think clearly it's pointing in the right direction around the potential that mindfulness has. And it's thrilling to see more and more research coming out for all of us who are such believers.
It is. But the one thing I caution is that just because some research is published in a peer-reviewed journal does not mean it's good research. Some journals have very low threshold for publication. You want the research to be in the journals with the highest threshold, because that means that peers have reviewed it to see that the methodology is really good. So, for example, Richie and Johnny did a study of MBSR where Richie developed what's called an active control group. This is like state of the art. The active control was a health enhancement program where teachers taught students the same number of hours in MBSR about what to eat and fitness and exercise, and people did it. And so they were very equivalent. And the instructors of that program were just as positive as the instructors in mindfulness. And guess what? Every self-report measure, has this helped you, was identical. The difference was in the biology.
Wow.
And if you look at the literature on mindfulness, too many of the studies are just self-report measures.
Right.
We would like to see a toughening of raising of standards in the mindfulness area and meditation generally. When we look at the research we did decades ago on meditation, it wouldn't meet the highest standards now. Because methods have gotten better and better, measurements have gotten better and better. So I'd like to see the best science show that mindfulness makes a real difference.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are the best ways we can teach mindfulness and SEL with high fidelity? Like what are you seeing out there that's really working? Are there practices that are particularly, I know it can be hard also about research is you give someone a program. Is it the gratitude week that makes all the difference, or is it the mindfulness week, or what might it be? What do you feel like might be some of the most important ingredients in the best programs?
Well, with SEL generally, we found that implementation makes all the difference. How well you do it. How well are the teachers prepared? Do the teachers do mindfulness themselves? Is it just something that, oh, well, my curriculum plan says I have to do this today, so they do it today? Or is it, I know this practice has an effect because I do it in my own life. That's far better. So going to scale has its risks, and the risks are that it'll become just by rote rather than authentic. Another risk is that there are all kinds of people claiming to be mindfulness instructors these days, but there's no real quality control there. That's a problem too. So what do they mean by mindfulness?
Right.
Who's teaching the teachers? Who's teaching the students? I would start right there.
Yeah. How do you think we can where do you stand on kind of like quality control? Like what do you think are the best ways to ensure that? Do you think it's more rigorous training programs? Do you think it's personal practice, a combination of all of those, better supervision? Like how can we do this so that we can scale? Because I think this is such a good question, such an important question, because we want kids to be getting good mindfulness, not just, all right, 5 minutes of mindfulness, teacher's going to sit back and, do their grading or check their own Facebook or whatever.
Exactly. So I think it's all three of those things.
Yeah.
Training, I think it's doing it yourself. I think it's supervision to make sure it's being done well. And, one of the things that, I've heard people who are kind of first-gen mindfulness people worry about is the dilution of training of mindfulness teachers. And I think that it's important to actually do a retreat and to do it daily so you really know it works. And also to have someone look in, check that what you're doing is really good.
Yeah.
Those are all ways to improve what gets delivered to students.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you've done a lot of this work. I'm going to ask kind of a larger question again, and you may or may not quite have an answer for it. But one of the themes of this particular summit is looking at mindfulness, and again that kind of broad definition of mindfulness, which itself has been a kind of a topic of discussion throughout this. So what do you mean by mindfulness, right? And I kind of mean more generally contemplative practice, bring that explicitly into education, as well as folding in social and emotional learning and those other elements. As you've seen this movement grow, like have you encountered it in other cultures? I know you travel a fair amount. I think you were just in Argentina recently. I heard from some friends. What do you see happening around the globe, or just in different kinds of contexts, workplaces, families, schools, things like that?
Let me say at the outset, I think it's a mistake to use the word mindfulness, meditation, or contemplative for me and to anybody else.
Yeah.
Bringing it to schools, I don't think it's appropriate even. non-spiritual context. I talk about attention training.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can use an alternate vocabulary.
Yeah.
User friendly, but doesn't put some people off.
Right.
I was in Argentina, as you say, as you note, and I've introduced mindfulness to business audiences around the world, and they're all receptive.
Mm-hmm.
Because I contextualize it with neuroscience research and with cognitive science. I don't talk about the spiritual aspects.
Right.
Oh, it's a spiritual practice, or can be, but the way I do it, it's just useful. And that also, there's a problem there. It makes it ethically neutral.
Mm-hmm.
In spiritual context, you have kind of underlying assumptions or rules. Are you doing this for your own benefit and for the benefit of other people? In this setting, you don't. You could be doing it because, hey, we're going to drive those guys out of business. So that's a risk you take.
Yeah.
In a non-spiritual context, whether business or school. And I find, back to your question about culture, that some cultures already have some traditions like this, and so they're more open to it. Some you have to be very careful. For example, in a very Catholic culture, you don't want to have any spiritual trappings.
Mm-hmm.
Eastern weird religion, science-based. So I think that just as you would be more astute to know who your audience is, the same goes for knowing what the culture accepts and rejects and is open to.
Yeah. So one thing besides mindfulness that I'm seeing a lot of excitement about, again, sort of in maybe a larger umbrella, but is really explicitly teaching kindness, teaching compassion, connections, relationships, in a sense, elements of what you might dub social intelligence. Can you share a little bit about that, about what you see happening on that front, or what exciting things you see on that front?
I see that as happening independent of the mindfulness aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, teaching compassion went hand in hand with mindfulness or insight practice. They've been dissociated in the modern world, where mindfulness is taken off, and now I see that compassion is being added back. But the two, traditionally, you would do a mindfulness practice and then end it with a dedication, which was for the well-being of all. Practice that. And the way I see it is unfolding in the school setting is not in those terms so much, but just in terms of cultivating kindness. The kids being nicer to each other, more empathic, more tuned in, more caring. And there's work out of the Max Planck Institute that suggests that, yes, the neural system that mindfulness expresses can be strengthened, and there are practices that will do it. The traditional practices are one way. But again, they need to be adapted so that they're free of, spiritual trappings.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is a wonderful idea, and in the book I did with Peter Senge, The Triple Focus, New Model of Education, we propose mindfulness, we propose building compassion, and then we added on systems. So that, because kids today are going to grow up in a world where the environment is going to be more and more threatening. And that is, in order to change that effectively, you need to understand it as a system.
Yeah.
Become an essential part of every student's education too.
Yeah. Is there I feel like I've been just sort of seeing sort of a few shoots of research also about how our own practice maybe does in fact impact others, like that when parents practice, that has an impact on the kids, that when a college kid practices, it impacts their roommates, and in terms of kind of that spread of not just mindfulness but also compassion, and that this does actually start to have a ripple effect. And I find that really inspiring when you kind of talk about we practice for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of others. And maybe it actually is happening, which is pretty incredible.
I think it's true, because as you change this system that you and your people you relate to changes also. Your changing changes the system for the better.
Right.
And also that more directly enhancing practices that aim to enhance compassion make people kinder and more generous.
Yeah.
So what you say sounds right to me. And
It's a little bit of that, sort of that kind of superficial reading of karma, of what goes around comes around, in a sense. Like, you put out goodness into the world and maybe something actually might actually come back. I know that's not the spiritual definition of karma, that's the misinterpretation, but it's kind of interesting to consider in that level too. Yeah.
That makes sense. Totally.
Yeah. And I know you've also written about another theme that's come up. I was speaking with Dan Siegel about it a little bit, and a number of other people, is ecology. And I know you've written about ecological intelligence and thinking systemically and thinking about the environment, and that's both a mindfulness practice and a compassion practice for everything around us. And as you said, a systems awareness.
I think that if you only have mindfulness and you only have compassion, you have good intention. Systems understanding, you know how to act effectively.
Yeah.
Without the systems understanding, it's a nice aspiration, but you may not really change things. And I think time that kids got the tools over the course of their life as adults to change the momentum that has been created by former generations, which unfortunately is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what do you see else kind of coming in the future? Do you have any other exciting projects that you're working on that we should be looking out for?
Well, I'd like businesses to be more mindful and compassionate, and start by looking at their environmental impacts. Our methodologies, one is life cycle assessment, that gives you a very fine-grained metric for your impacts in air, water, soil, carbon footprint, everything.
Yeah.
Make that transparent. Not only make it transparent, but show what you're doing to lessen it instead of being a bad player. The dilemma is this: every time someone does something that harms the environment, someone is making money.
Right.
And so I don't think you can unpack the economic system from the environmental system. I think they go hand in hand when it comes to human impacts. And it's the human impacts that we want to change, because my argument to business is that today's students, the ones that are now learning mindfulness and compassion and maybe hopefully systems, are tomorrow's customers, tomorrow's key players in your company. Care about this in a way you, older generations, never had to. And if you care about the organization you're in and you want it to survive into the future, you'll be the first to do this.
Yeah.
And to change things for the better, and to make it clear, ideally at point of purchase, so that Gen Z, as consumers in the future, can vote with their dollars for the better company. Because I think they'll want to in a way no other generation ever has before. Yeah.
And I think we're already seeing that. I do feel like that certainly plays into my choices in terms of consuming. And I see a company do something, and maybe it's a little bit of greenwashing sometimes, and I have to kind of try to see through that. But it really makes a difference, and I see that really in young people. I mean, even I work as a psychotherapist part time, and I even see that in very young kids. It's amazing the level of awareness that they now have about their impact in a way that. I grew up, my dad worked for the EPA, and yet, and I had I thought about this a lot, but this younger generation even more so. And it's inspiring, and I hope it's in time for sure.
Yeah. And I think what companies are doing today is a nice thing, but I don't think it's sufficient. No company, even Patagonia, even the most virtuous companies, that is fully naked, fully transparent about its impact. Lets customers know, and also shows how it's improving in a way which is legitimized by an independent authority. I think
right.
Something like a Consumer Reports. Because I'm not going to believe, Unilever does wonderful things, but I'm not going to believe them about their own impacts. I want an independent agency to confirm that what they're saying is true. And then I think, oh, well, great. It's so good what they're doing.
Right.
You can be skeptical. You could be greenwashing, as you say.
Yeah.
Marketing.
Yeah. Because I see that, I'm like, oh, that looks great. That by 2025 they're going to be carbon free, but it's like, but what's going to make them actually do that? Like, is that like they can say that? Like, I want to be carbon free by 2025. Will I? I don't know.
Can they be regenerative?
Right. Right.
That's the big game.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a book being written, Paul Hawken, who did that wonderful book, Drawdown. Ways you can lower your carbon impact. Now he's working on a book on regenerative technologies.
Oh, cool.
I think is the next step.
Yeah. 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 Well, it's exciting, and I think if we're able to educate our young people, I think also just more creative solutions will arise for so many things as we teach them mindfulness and compassion and other, social emotional awareness and systems thinking. I think that's going to help us, educate ourselves and come up with those solutions we need.
Here's what I tell businesses, and I think it follows just from what you said. This is an enormous entrepreneurial opportunity. Yeah. You have to reinvent everything.
Right.
Who is going to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dan. Again, this was a real honor for me to be, having this conversation with you, this dialogue. And I know our viewers are going to get so much out of this because, again, you've been such a innovator and leader and thought leader and action leader in this world of mindfulness, contemplative practice, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, all of this kind of thinking. And so thank you just for all your work that you've done in addition to spending 45 minutes with all of us. I just really appreciate your work in the world, and I look forward to more of it. I get your books when they come out right away. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and we'll get something of benefit from this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.